This is not your ordinary farm crisis. We call it Farmageddon.
And if they don't do something, there's going to be some farmers that ain't going to be around next year.
American agriculture is in crisis. Right now, farmers across the heartland are watching their livelihoods crumble as crop prices collapse, trade wars devastate export markets, and weather extremes destroy yields. This isn't some distant threat, it's happening today, and it could fundamentally change how America feeds itself. Economic collapse hitting American farms. The numbers tell a devastating story. U.S. farmers are staring down a projected $45.5 billion agriculture deficit, with row crop producers alone reporting combined losses of $34.6 billion before insurance and support payments. This isn't a minor downturn, it's an existential threat to American farming as we know it. Let's break this down by crop. Corn farmers have absorbed over $16 billion in losses. Soybean producers are underwater by $11 billion. Cotton and rice farmers in the South are facing what industry insiders describe as brutal losses from commodity price collapses. The situation has become so dire that 259 farm bankruptcies have already been recorded in the Midwest, signaling the beginning of what could become a wave of foreclosures reminiscent of the 1980s farm crisis.
Well, this is the worst time since the 80s, and I was farming in the 80s, where farmers were going out of business. Farm foreclosures are on the rise, farm suicides are on the rise, farm bankruptcies are on the rise.
The price collapse is staggering in its scope. Farmers are receiving prices for their crops comparable to what their parents and grandparents earned 4 to 5 decades ago, while their operating costs have skyrocketed. Tennessee, for example, lost $430 million in agriculture this year alone, with nearly $730 million lost over the past 2 years.
For the crops they're producing, like corn, cotton, soybeans, and wheat, those 4 major row crops that we produce here in Tennessee, we're seeing prices like they were getting 40 and 50 years ago. There's no business that can sustain that.
The math simply doesn't work anymore. Farmers are reporting losses of $100 to $200 per acre for corn and soybeans, marking 4 consecutive years of negative returns. When you're losing money on every acre you plant, there's only so long you can survive before the bank comes calling. But low prices are only half the equation. The cost of actually growing these crops has exploded. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese imports have driven up machinery and fertilizer prices by 20 to 50% in some cases. New high-horsepower tractors now cost $600,000 to $700,000. Input costs for seeds, crop protection, and equipment have reached levels that make profitable farming nearly impossible at current commodity prices.
New equipment costs have increased by 60% in the last 8 years. John Deere, a U.S. manufacturing icon, says U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum will cost them $600 million this year.
The situation has forced farmers to make impossible choices. Many are selling off equipment to stay viable. Joel's Tractors in Strawberry Point, Iowa, has seen a 30% jump in farm machinery going up for auction this year. Farmers who once took pride in maintaining modern fleets are now scrambling to keep aging equipment running because they simply cannot afford replacements.
Put a fingerful of grease in there.
Keeping aging tractors running has Lawrence Christensen and his team working at full throttle.
The demand is stronger than the availability.
The personal toll on farming families is immense. Franklin Carmack, a 5th-generation Tennessee farmer growing cotton, soybeans, and corn, has been forced to take on side jobs selling t-shirts, driving trucks, and repairing boats just to make ends meet. The stress has taken a physical toll. He now requires 4 blood pressure pills daily. What haunts him most is the fear that he might be the one to break a legacy that began in the late 1800s. Carmack and his longtime friend Jeffrey Daniels are facing combined losses of nearly $800,000 this year. Daniels points directly at tariffs as a major culprit, noting that any equipment part that comes from China now carries a tariff that manufacturers simply pass along to farmers. The question both men are asking themselves is whether to keep rolling the dice, hoping things will turn around. But the outlook isn't encouraging. The federal government has responded with what it calls bridge payments, $12 billion announced in December 2025 to support farmers hit by tariffs and market disruptions. But farmers on the ground are skeptical. John Kipley, who runs a tax firm in Aberdeen, South Dakota, working with struggling farmers, notes that you can't take vague promises of bridge payments to the bank when lenders want concrete numbers. The view from farm country is that federal aid amounts to a Band-Aid when they need stitches. Caleb Ragland, a Kentucky soybean farmer, called the $12 billion a Band-Aid on a deep wound. Doug Somke, president of the South Dakota Farmers Union, compared it to fighting an inferno with a garden hose. The morale across the farming community has hit rock bottom. Perhaps most concerning is the knock-on effect on rural communities. When farms fail, it's not just the farming families who suffer. Rural hospitals close. Schools shut down. Main Street businesses that depend on agricultural spending disappear. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond the farm gate, threatening the very fabric of rural America. The crisis has also claimed lives. Brent Foreman, who has farmed in Macon County, Missouri since the 1970s, has lost 3 farmer relatives and 2 neighbors to suicide amid the ongoing crisis. The mental health toll of watching generational farms slip away while working harder than ever for diminishing returns cannot be overstated. Industry consolidation is accelerating the decline. Small family operations are being squeezed out, with land shifting to mega farms, hedge funds, and foreign entities. The number of producers has dropped 10% since 2016, with 4,000 farms destroyed or repurposed. An old dairy farmer who ran 250 head for over 50 years lost everything to consolidation, now surviving on Social Security and odd jobs, his dreams of passing the farm to his children unrealized. How America lost its markets. The world is turning away from American agriculture, and the consequences are devastating. China, once the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, has systematically shifted its purchases to Brazil and Argentina. The numbers are stark. Retaliatory tariffs slashed U.S. agricultural exports by an estimated $27 billion from mid-2018 through 2019, with annualized losses around $13.2 billion.
Poor markets, and every time the president says tariffs, the markets go down and countries begin to run away from American agriculture.
The soybean situation epitomizes the broader crisis. John Boyd Jr., founder and president of the National Black Farmers Association, lived through the first Trump administration's trade war with China. When tariffs were first imposed, he was selling soybeans at $16.80 a bushel. By the time that term ended, prices had crashed to less than $8 a bushel, and the markets never really recovered.
The first time the president imposed tariffs on China, I was selling soybeans at $16.80 a bushel. By the time President Trump left office, it was less than $8 a bushel. And the markets never really came back. So what the point I'm trying to make here is the tariffs didn't work the first time the president imposed them.
The damage extends far beyond soybeans. Washington State's apple exports to China plummeted from $120 million to just $1 million during the 2018 trade war, and recovery took 7 years. Similar patterns have played out across multiple agricultural sectors, with farmers watching helplessly as their traditional export markets evaporated. What makes this particularly painful is how dependent American agriculture has become on exports. As Tom Halverson, a former Goldman Sachs executive now serving as CEO of CoBank, explains, the agricultural economy is fundamentally dependent on access to overseas export markets. America produces far more than it can consume domestically.
As far into the future as we can foresee, the agricultural economy of the United States is very, very dependent on access to overseas export markets. My uncle who lived
The historical context makes this even more tragic. American farmers worked for decades to build these markets. One Iowa farmer's uncle was among the first American farmers to go on a trade mission to China in the late 1970s. Back then, the U.S. sold no soybeans to China. Over the following decades, that market grew until China was purchasing close to 50% of all U.S. soybeans, an inconceivably large volume shipped from the heartland to the West Coast and across the Pacific.
From where we're right now sitting, was one of the first American farmers to go on a trade mission to China in the late 1970s. And back then, we didn't sell any soybeans to China. And since that time, we've grown our export market to China from zero to being the biggest export market. And until our recent trade disagreements with China, we got up to the point where it wasn't yet 50%, but it was closing on 50% of all U.S. soybeans got exported to China, which is an inconceivably large amount of soybeans that are being grown in this part of the world, put on trains, shipped to the West Coast, put on ships and sent to China.
Now that market is gone, and it may never fully return. Global commodity expert Javier Blas, who covers commodities for Bloomberg Opinion, explains that the reversal in U.S. agricultural trade is a structural feature, not a temporary blip. Buyers have long memories. Japanese soy importers still remember a brief trade embargo the U.S. imposed more than 50 years ago. Once you scare buyers into finding alternatives, they don't easily come back.
The damage is done. Every time that you scare buyers, the buyers are looking for an alternative, and they will have very long memories. Japanese soy importers still remember the very brief trade embargo imposed by the United States more than 50 years ago on soybeans. And that is half a century later. The buyers still remember that. Once you open that door, you cannot put it back. It has been done, and I think that the damage is done.
Brazil has emerged as the primary beneficiary of America's self-inflicted wounds. Over the past 40 years, Brazil has transformed itself into the supermarket of the world, a role the United States used to play. In 2017, Brazil surpassed the U.S. as the world's largest soybean producer and exporter, thanks in part to lower production costs and what seems like unlimited arable land. The U.S. is now experiencing something that hasn't happened in 70 years. 3 consecutive annual trade deficits in agriculture. The country that once fed the world is increasingly reliant on imports to feed itself, while its exports face rejection abroad. Adding insult to injury, the Trump administration recently gave Argentina, a direct competitor, a $20 billion financial lifeline. Argentina promptly cut the price of its own soy exports to China, further undercutting U.S. farmers. The sense of betrayal in farm country is palpable.
Last week, the Trump administration gave Argentina a financial lifeline, a $20 billion loan. But Argentina then cut the price of its own soy exports to China, undercutting U.S. farmers.
The harvest season has arrived without any Chinese orders to purchase soybeans. Kevin Deinert, a fifth-generation farmer near Mitchell, South Dakota, has overflowing grain bins from an unprofitable harvest. He remains cautiously optimistic about potential trade deals, but notes that until something is in writing, it's hard to get excited. American soybean farmers have been used as the tip of the spear in trade disputes, taking the brunt of the damage while waiting for promises that may never materialize. The farmers' preference is clear. They want trade, not aid. J.D. Meyer, a fifth-generation Iowa farmer, puts it directly. He doesn't want direct payments from the government. He wants markets that will buy his grain. The last thing farmers want is to rely on government payments, but without functioning export markets, that's exactly where they've been forced.
Biggest thing, I guess for me as a farmer is I want to make sure we have markets. I don't want direct payments. I would rather not have direct payments from the government. If we can have markets that will buy the grain and stuff from us, not have to depend on the government for it, and develop those markets.
We don't want to rely on government payments. That's the last thing that we want to do. We've worked.
The labor crisis compounds the trade challenges. Immigration crackdowns have created severe labor shortages in agriculture, where domestic workers are simply not available or willing to do the grueling physical work required. Jack King, vice president at King Orchards in Michigan, describes apple picking as an absolute miserable job that very few Americans are interested in. Without the H-2A visa program for foreign workers, He couldn't grow apples at all. A dairy farmer who has relied on immigrant labor for 30 years explains the reality bluntly. There simply aren't enough domestic workers willing to do agricultural work. The cows need to be fed, watered, cleaned, and milked every day. These are living creatures that cannot wait for policy debates to be resolved. The current system has built an economy that relies on immigrant workers, while public policy demonizes them. Environmental devastation and the uncertain future. Beyond economics and trade, American agriculture faces environmental challenges that threaten its long-term viability. Water scarcity is reaching crisis levels, particularly in California, where the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is restricting usage to prevent aquifer depletion. The projections are alarming. About 1 million acres of farmland could become unusable by 2030 to 2040, affecting crops like almonds, alfalfa, and cotton. The underground water situation is dire. Aquifers are depleting 20 times faster than they can naturally refill, causing land subsidence of up to 28 feet in some areas. For ranchers who depend on irrigation, losing water access means losing everything. One rancher's situation captures the desperation. After learning he wouldn't receive any irrigation water, his cattle operation effectively shut down. Without water, there's no way to raise cattle. The family faces going out of business after generations on the land. Drought conditions have forced painful decisions across the agricultural sector. Corey Beerley, a South Dakota rancher whose family has operated along the Bad River for over a century, endured years of punishing droughts that forced him to downsize his herd significantly. While he's now benefiting from high beef prices to pay off accumulated debts, he's budgeting conservatively and isn't celebrating yet. Weather extremes have become the new normal. Jed Welder, a farmer in Sheridan, Michigan, endured 43 days without rain that cut his corn yield by a third. Despite producing his best wheat yield ever, prices are as low as they were in the 1970s. And China, which at the same time last year had bought about 40% of the U.S. crop, has been entirely absent from the soybean market. The citrus industry has been devastated by disease. Citrus greening, a blight that originated in China, has destroyed 95% of Florida's orange groves, with no effective treatments available. This has reduced overall U.S. citrus output by approximately 2/3, with the disease now spreading to California and Texas. Recent incidents of Chinese researchers caught smuggling genetically modified wheat blight into Michigan have raised concerns about potential sabotage to other crops. Soil degradation presents another long-term threat. Decades of industrial monocropping, heavy chemical use, and intensive tillage have depleted soils of nutrients and beneficial biology. The Green Revolution practices adopted after World War II boosted short-term yields, but have degraded the land over generations. Practices focusing narrowly on NPK fertilizers while ignoring micronutrients have produced crops that are increasingly nutrient-poor and vulnerable to stress. One farmer who grew up on a family farm with row crops laments what he sees today: empty fields with soil that looks haggard. The rich earth his family once cultivated has been depleted by industrial practices. It hurts his soul to witness the degradation. Climate projections suggest the worst is yet to come. Studies indicate global crop yields could fall 30% by 2050 due to heating, potentially halving calories per head as populations grow. U.S. yields are already plateauing despite technological advances, and more frequent multi-breadbasket failures are predicted as weather patterns become increasingly erratic. The livestock sector faces its own crisis. U.S. cattle inventories have dropped to 70-year lows, with feed costs elevated by the Ukraine war and supply chain disruptions reducing available herds further. Major processing facilities are closing. Tyson's $426 million Nebraska plant shut down in January 2026, eliminating 3,200 jobs and devastating the local community. The U.S. cattle kill is expected to drop by 1.5 to 2 million head in 2026 due to smaller herds and reduced imports from Mexico. Government responses have been a mixed bag. While bailouts provide temporary relief, They don't address the structural problems driving the crisis. The USDA has announced crop insurance reforms and various support programs, but critics argue these measures actually perpetuate the cycle by encouraging overproduction and creating dependency rather than building resilience. Some government actions have actively harmed farmers. In March 2025, the USDA canceled $1 billion in funding for schools and food banks to purchase from local farms, a decision that critics say attacks children, agriculture, and small producers, while favoring consolidation. Cuts to agencies like NOAA and NASA have reduced farmers' access to climate forecasting and adaptation support, potentially worsening future crop failures. The question of government support raises difficult philosophical questions. As Halverson points out, feeding a population is a national security consideration for every country on Earth. Americans take food security for granted because the agricultural economy has been so productive for so long. But safeguarding that capability requires support infrastructure, while also avoiding creating bad risk-taking behavior.
If you travel around the world, as I have in my career, you'll realize and know that feeding your population is a national security consideration for everyone on Earth, right? And we kind of take that for granted here because we're so productive in our agricultural economy. We don't just feed ourselves, we feed a lot of other people all around the world. But being able to have a food self-sufficiency and a comprehensive, productive, safe, secure sources on a through-the-cycle basis of food and fiber for the United States of America.
Or unsustainable subsidies. The future of American farming now hangs in the balance. Riley Sides, a grazier watching his neighbors struggle, predicts 30% of farmers might quit in the next 5 years. The parallel to the 1980s farm crisis is unavoidable, but this time high land prices coexist with zero profits, a particularly toxic combination. For farming families, the stakes are deeply personal. These aren't just businesses, they're legacies built over generations. Stu Swanson is the third generation farming corn and soybeans in Iowa. J.D. Meyer is the fifth generation on his family's land, raising the sixth generation there now. The thought of being the one who breaks a chain stretching back to the late 1800s weighs heavily on those who may be forced to sell.
This is where I grew up, and I'm the fifth generation, so we're raising the sixth generation here on this farm. So back in the late 1800s, my great-grandparents would have came here and started the farm.
The hope is that the next generation will want to continue. Some farmers' children are finding innovative paths forward, like Todd Western IV, who started an urban farm in Minneapolis after feeling a deep responsibility to carry forward his family's legacy as a black farmer. Urban farming is largely tariff-proof and allows farmers to set their own prices. But it's not a solution that works at scale. The agricultural industry needs trade deals that restore export markets. It needs input costs that allow profitable farming. It needs immigration policies that provide the labor agriculture requires. It needs climate adaptation strategies and sustainable practices that preserve the land for future generations. And it needs all of this soon, because farmers are running out of time. As the commodity expert Bloss warns, putting all this together, it's simply not good business to be a farmer in America today. When the business isn't viable, farmers eventually call it quits. But even more concerning is what happens next. The children of today's struggling farmers may decide that farming just isn't worth the sacrifice. If current trends continue, experts warn of escalating food prices and broader economic instability by mid-2026. The crisis affecting American agriculture today could affect every American's grocery bill tomorrow. The supermarket of the world is struggling to feed itself, and the clock is ticking. The time for half measures and empty promises has passed. What happens next will determine whether America remains an agricultural powerhouse or becomes dependent on foreign nations to feed its people. What are your thoughts on this crop crisis in the U.S.? Share in the comments below.